much. We begin by acknowledging that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation.
It is wonderful to have so many leading experts in climate change with us for the next several days on our campus.
We will hear from 50 speakers and moderators, many of whom are authors of the IPCC's Sixth Assessment Report, and all of whom have deep expertise on different facets of climate change.
The scientists contributed voluntarily their time and expertise to IPCC assessments.
Not change that much. I mean, the idea is, Alex said, that we are assessing the scientific literature and developing a synthetic understanding of what the state of the science is. So we want to be policy relevant. We want to understand, like, what does the science say about X, Y, and Z? What is the confidence around this? What are the different solution spaces for different parts of the world, for different sectors? But we're not saying to policymakers, this is what you should do. And that's a really, really big difference.
The assessments that we do in the IPCC are designed to go a little bit further than that. It's to say, what is the state of understanding in the scientific literature, to draw out those key messages and to attach confidence and uncertainty language to those findings. So that
the IPCC process, I think, does scientific, the scientific rigor part of the IPCC process. Yes, it is, scientific community that assesses the literature. But I think also it's important to say that it doesn't do research, because a lot of people have this sense that the IPCC does research, but it actually doesn't do research. But it does assess a very comprehensive sample, I'd say, of research, and it does it in a very thorough manner.
We hope that this 3-day conference will provide a basis for deeper reflections on climate issues among participants, especially students, the future leaders.
Saying that the scientific evidence is unequivocal, climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to a secure, livable future. Thank you.
We're not going to solve climate change unless cities that currently exist undergo a major transformation. And we can have lots of discussions about what those transformations need to be.
Degree, in order to stabilize the temperature, we need to reach net zero CO2. That there are some, let's say, economic sectors that are what we call hard to abate sectors, which will probably never be net zero emissions. We have to have some sectors of the economy that need to go to net negative emissions to compensate for those positive emissions from other sectors.
Transformative change, we really have to think about this as both an equity challenge as well as a techno challenge, and we have to look beyond carbon. And in my own work, I've started to think about the connections between how fossil fuels, the root causes of our fossil fuel dependence, go back to the ways in which we've marginalized and dumped pollution on certain communities and certain people here in the United States as well as around the world. And as we think about solutions to cut carbon emissions, let's think about centering those people who've been on the margins now bearing the brunt. Solutions that really work for them, providing access to clean energy, affordable energy, energy justice, climate resilience investments in these places where it's desperately needed.
The second point is about the cities of tomorrow, those that are getting built or getting revitalized or rebuilt. Those cities need to avoid emissions. So the existing cities need to reduce their emissions, they need to decarbonize, they need to get to net zero.
We concluded that adaptation has many benefits, but the evidence of risk reduction, basically whether it's reducing vulnerability, exposure, or hazard for those adopting those adaptation is still something limited, and I hope that many of the students sitting in this auditorium would think that it's a worthy enough topic to take up for their future studies and dissertation, because that indeed is a huge knowledge gap. We don't know how well adaptation works and how does one compare with the other. But overall, I think our conclusion is that it can't be just one thing or the other. You just simply cannot say that we have adopted, say, the heat resistant or certain kind of seed that is good for a higher temperature, because the farmer at the same time experiences heat stress, and a couple of months down the line, they then also experience floods.
Climate change is already here, and that's affecting different sectors. And what are the major impacts that we're seeing? And as Aditi explained, this increased extreme events, including droughts, floods, and heat waves, have put millions of people at risk of acute food insecurity, and particularly in Africa, Asia, Central and South America, and small islands, and the Arctic.
In an earlier session today, we were talking about environmental history as well, and it's great, I think, for many of our students who weren't alive in 1992 to hear about those kinds of moments where there is an optimism we can make a difference. And I think in what you shared, you see both sides of that, the optimism, but then also the need for greater equity in the process.
I think the interdisciplinary kind of whole system view is important, but I also think students that are really want to engage in this and move forward you also need to have subject-specific knowledge. I think it's key, really, as Linda said before, really understanding the models, understanding the processes is necessary. But like a lot of the work I do with a systems view, so to try and understand the individual processes while also looking at kind of the whole system and the kind of feedback, synergies, trade-offs, as Alex said, like the IPCC synthesis report. The goal is to kind of look at what the enabling and constraining conditions are across the system. But in order to be able to do this, you really need to have some people that are there with the subject-specific knowledge.
The first idea is that Earth is a system of complex interdependencies that span spatial and temporal scales. It's a skill to be able to zoom in and out of these scales and contextualize components of these systems. And we've seen these recurring themes of systems and scales throughout this symposium. The second idea was illustrated on Monday in Kristen's session by Dr. Ruane, where he showed some maps of impacts from changing climate on various regions. And on those maps, there were places where there's still not enough information. There's limited data. And if I can add an interpretation there, a lack of resources, persons and otherwise, to gather that data. There are still areas with really big questions that need to be answered. Dr. Ruane said we need to know how climate impacts are changing in intensity, frequency, duration, and timing, and how these things vary locally and regionally. So the second idea is that our work as scientists is far from over.
And I'm thinking of a comment that was made to me yesterday over lunch by our distinguished keynote speaker, Debra Roberts. So Dr. Roberts was giving a talk at Harvard, and the Harvard scholars there asked if the IPCC was going to be developing a teaching wing to better communicate the complex findings of the IPCC. And it came up in our conversation that the IPCC already has to manage this unbelievably complex process of assessment and consensus building and communication that keeps the climate negotiation process moving forward, as well as maintaining a position of neutrality that keeps bringing people to the table. So maybe it's actually wrong to ask the IPCC to do the entire climate fight, right? To do the science and the teaching and the activism. The climate crisis needs a lot of people doing a lot of jobs. And the job of teaching about the climate crisis is actually literally our job.
Does the IPCC have a metric for measuring like the social implications of like in terms of environmental justice in different places? So, you guys were talking about particularly in the US, helping marginalized communities, or like throughout the world, like, addressing energy justice, but then it's also, I think there's another aspect of like when we're thinking about different kinds of renewable energies or different technologies, there's a lot of extraction. And so how do you measure if there is a metric, or like how do you account for keeping companies and different people and governments accountable for these different kinds of justice along the system, like within the system of a transition, if that makes sense?
IPCC reports, to begin with, it's really important to note they're not policy prescriptive. They're meant to be a compendium of the latest state of the science. And the way this particular issue is addressed, and Gabrielle, you should jump in as well, is trying to talk about pathways to cut emissions that are aligned with sustainable development goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are global goals around basic human well-being indicators like health and things like that. But it is not granular to the point of thinking about specific communities that might be at the receiving end of some of these trade-offs we talked about, you know, whether it's mining or other kinds of extractive methods. And that's why, to me, the IPCC science, it's critical. It sets a framework for our understanding, but it's never going to be enough. And taking that science and downscaling it to the point of, so what does this mean in my community? What does this mean for solutions and policy recommendations is a step beyond what the IPCC is set up to do. Again, it's a very valuable assessment of the science on a regular basis. But those kinds of policy prescriptions, it kind of stops short of going too far down that path.
We can see here in Carlisle the legacies of redlining through racial segregation in the community, which can impact things such as food security, food sovereignty, access to green spaces, etc., which all impact the community's resiliency level. And when thinking about this, I think it's very important as students who are, in Carlisle for about 4 years, how can we be active participants in this community?
The third idea is that it's not a weakness, but a strength that science is always changing, updating, and growing. But to appreciate the strengths of science, we must grapple with scientific uncertainty, confidence, and consensus.
That you do not necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Local communities are fighting for more equitable climate action already. And with that, I urge you all to get involved with local government, local organizations here in Carlisle, and beyond in the places that you call home to make an impact. It is so easy to get caught up and feel a very fatalistic view of thinking that we cannot do something, and it's also very easy to fall into the view that we need to fix everything at once. And we can meet somewhere in the middle because people are already doing this work and working very hard, as you can see from everyone that's spoken so far. So I urge you all to get involved, and going beyond an individual basis, we can really make an impact.